Hello and welcome to episode 13 of That Encyclopedia Podcast with your hosts, me, Will, and Jacob.
Hello.
Today we will be talking about a topic involving India, pirates, trade, slaves, money, power. We're talking about the East India Company.
I thought you were going to say drug cartel.
Well, that wouldn't be too far wrong. They were at one point an extremely military organisation with 260,000 soldiers, twice the size of the British Army. Yes, the East India Company was originally English and later British. Joint stock company, so a business entity founded in the year 1600. It lasted over 200 years and became the largest company, the largest corporation in the world, and potentially of all time. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, of course there were two East India companies, which often jostled against each other for competition, and occasionally joined forces when they wanted to strong-arm some other trading companies in the area out of business. When someone says East India Company without any clarification, it normally defaults to the English or British East India Company. But there was also the Dutch East India Company, although this is often called the VOC or the VOC, which is just an abbreviation of its name in Dutch, which I will not attempt to pronounce, but just means Dutch East India Company. And I think for me the most important word in the title is company, because if you were to substitute the story of the East India Company with a state, a country, a nation, then it wouldn't be too eye-raising. I mean, it's quite standard. It gets founded, it strikes either lucky or has friends in high places, gathers some territory, gathers some money from the territory, establishes a military branch, expands, eventually overextends, it all goes wrong, people suffer, people die, it gets, normally I would say conquered, but in this case just dissolved because it's a company. But the fact that this is something that happened to a private corporation, in effect, even if it did have state funding and backing, is remarkable, and the closest we've ever come really to the sort of stories told in the cyberpunk genre, or any sort of punk genre in literature, I would say. Would you agree with that assessment?
I think so. I think the East India Company represents this early, some would describe it as pre-capitalist exercise in private power to an extreme that, well, we haven't seen since because democracy simply won't allow it. But at the time, wow, they had a lot of power, and it's a lot of power in the hands of individuals, stock owners, and businessmen looking for opportunities in parts of the world that, frankly, had, you could say they had some say, although obviously limited say. The East India Company, although called the East India Company, was the global trading company out of Britain, so it did have a relationship with America and the sort of European colonization of America. Obviously there wasn't that much in terms of a choice or a respect for the ownership of land that was already occupied there. And in general, we have to remember that back in these days, individuals under large organizations or under large states didn't really have much autonomy themselves. These were not democracies. These were kingdoms, empires, perpetrating ways to make more money.
Yeah, I agree, and it's this really strange kind of mix of all of these entities and polities and interests and activities coming together under under a flag of a unique company. I'm sure everyone's familiar with kind of where India is. It's sometimes called like the world's elephant's ear. If you look on a globe or a map, often India or the Indian subcontinent looks like the ear of an elephant, and to either side of it, sticking out into the ocean, are two extremely important trade routes, or at least at the time of the kind of 17th, 18th, 19th centuries, were two extremely important trade routes. To the west of the Indian subcontinent is the Arabian Sea, and then to the east is the Bay of Bengal, and then to the south you have kind of the broader Indian Ocean. And the Bay of Bengal, east of India, is where the British East India Company established itself, and for over 100 years it ruled the bay and its immediate territories basically unchallenged. King Charles II expanded its powers later to enable the company to form its own military, to conduct its own diplomacy, up to and including declaring war and making peace with other nation states, to enact its own courts and dispense its own justice within its territory, and so in practice to make its own laws and to rule as it saw fit, which it did. And once it was given this base of operations and this legal white card to do what it liked, it recruited heavily from the local native Indian population, and in conjunction and coordination with its own private soldiers, pushed into India proper, and acquired territory, vast swathes of territory that had recently been kind of fractured by the decline of the Mughal Empire and subsequent ruling class of India at that period. There's a lot of history and politics that kind of saturate every single sentence you could say about this time and about this part of the world. It was densely populated, it was extremely rich, had continues to have a detailed and well documented history in its own right, even before and excluding European interference there. But in essence, the Indian subcontinent had for a long time, when the European companies arrived, been ruled by a Muslim Islamic ruling class, whereas the lower classes of the society there were Hindu. And although initially it hadn't been particularly conflictual, there was kind of freedom of religion to a great extent, over time this ruling class began to become more and more aggressive and fundamentalist in its interpretation of Islam, and began to impose this on the native Hindu Indians, which inevitably led to a violent rebellion which fractured the empire and left the territory disorganized. And so it was easy pickings for a well-funded, disciplined army with modern, in quotes at the time, of course, modern technology and modern military tactics and experience to hoover up. So that might be my kind of brief summary of where the company was and how it ascended. But I could keep talking for forever about the East India Company. What struck you about this article in particular?
Well, to start with, we've talked a little bit about where the East India Company had its sort of zone of control, and that's one of the things that I find interesting to think about in historic terms, because we have to remember, although it might not be too difficult to get from Britain to India today, we've got planes, we've got the Suez Canal, but originally we're talking about explorers such as Sir Walter Raleigh and a number of others, James Lancaster, and we're talking about them sailing around one of the landmarks being the Cape of Good Hope. We're talking about them sailing all the way around South Africa, so from Britain down past Portugal and Spain and around the entire continent of Africa to then get round to India, where they managed to amass quite the zone of control. So I just find it interesting to think of how far away the influence of Britain extended, and even England extended, again being quite a small country in the scheme of things.
It's a good point, and you have to account for the time that would have taken as well. When in the early voyages to the East Indies, when Sir James Lancaster, who you mentioned, who was the commander of the first company voyage in 1601 to the East Indies, aboard a vessel called the Red Dragon, pretty cool name, he was successful and returned in 1603. When he left England, it was ruled by Queen Elizabeth I, but when he returned, only 2 years later, I mean, I say only, it's a long time to be away from home, but still, Elizabeth had died, and his country had a new king, which was James I. Also, the war with Spain had ended in that time, so he'd come back to a different monarch on the throne, and to a pretty major war being concluded in his absence, which he hadn't known about. Actually, I experienced a similar thing just last month, to be honest, on a much smaller scale. I guess it can still happen. When I left the UK in early September for my holiday, Queen Elizabeth II was on the throne, and by the time I had come back in late September, Queen Elizabeth had died, and it was now King Charles III on the throne. So that was just a little personal parallel there, but I think the time point is well made.
Yeah,
perhaps.
Go on.
Well, I was just wondering, perhaps we should say, I should ask, you mentioned the East India Companies being among the richest in the world. I know that the Dutch company, the VOC, at its height, was worth, in modern terms, about $8 trillion, which is about 8 times more wealthy than Apple was at its height, and I think the Dutch version is among the most successful, strictly in terms of money, as opposed to territory or influence politically. But what made these companies so successful? What did they find in India that they were desperate to export back to Europe that gave these enormous returns on their investments?
Well, there were a few things. I'm not familiar with which were the most profitable, but there were a number of products that were of value. One being saltpeter. Saltpeter is a compound that a mined compound found in India, and and it is one of the components in gunpowder. So, for one part, the saltpeter in India became a very significant commodity, and that because that is a commodity valuable to, of course, the private army of the East India Company, and also the state army of Britain. And one would imagine, to some extent, that some of these products got around, maybe even into the hands of foe or neutral territories. But I remember reading that there were even reports of persons being able to sell some of this saltpeter untaxed, whereas of course tax did exist at the time that we're talking about, but the products were of such important strategic value that they could get away with selling them untaxed in some circumstances. Demand was extremely high. Other products include spices. So, remind me, which islands are known to be the Spice Islands?
The Spice Islands?
Yeah.
I mean, I've always just termed the Spice Islands as a... Wikipedia says Maluku Islands in the Pacific Ocean. Part of modern-day Indonesia.
Right.
Which, but at the time, of course, would have been part of the Indies. So, islands within the Indies.
Yeah, the reach of the East India Company did stretch quite far in the end, didn't it? Because eventually there was a British colony in Hong Kong, of course, and British influence in modern-day Indonesia. So there was spices from there, cotton, indigo, a distinctive blue dye, sugar, salt, arguably luxury items of the time, spices, tea, now tea's a big one, opium, so that would be why we call them the biggest cartel in history, because they trade drugs and have a private army. And of course, they had a role in the slave trade as well. But as I said, I don't know the exact proportions that each of these brought revenue. Well, there's a few things to consider. Which of these products represented the largest flow of money into the company, and which of these products were the most profitable, because those could be two different questions with two different answers. But I can't answer that. I'm sure you can find out.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the exact proportions of which products were more profitable and which were less are less impactful than the holistic kind of cumulative sum of everything being monopolized by the British East India Company and harvested tax-free from local rulers and then exported at sometimes up to 400% profits per ship invested. I think it's important to bear in mind as well that the distances involved that we've mentioned mean that it does take a considerable degree of trust from a merchant in Europe to back a ship that's due to set sail for the East Indies. Because if anything happens to the ship at any point along its journey to or from its destination, then the whole investment is lost, along with everything that it was carrying. That 400% return on investment waiting for the European merchant could be struck in a very unlucky storm hours before it was due to make port again after a year, and everything was lost to the sea. So it was very much a risk-reward gamble for these adventurers. And in fact, the adventurers, as a term, capital T, capital A, is kind of, I think, the informal designation for the original group of merchants and explorers who secured the royal charter that founded the initial East India voyage from the English.
Before you go on,
first... Mm-hmm.
Do you mind explaining what a royal charter is?
It is essentially a document that is issued by a ruling monarch that enables something. Normally, a royal charter is used to make laws public, but it could also be used to enable kind of private entities to achieve legal recognition, like corporations or universities, societies. Anything that uses the term royal in its title almost certainly has a royal charter at some point. I guess the biggest, most famous example would probably be, at least in England, would probably be Magna Carta 1215, which restricted the powers of the monarch in favour of the lower nobility, which, despite being a blow to the power of the monarchy, was still a royal charter signed by the king. Yes, that is a royal charter.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if you were familiar with the full extent of the British East India Company. Did you know that it made it as far as Japan?
Yes, I did read something about that. But
yeah,
my memory
wasn't
poor at the best of times.
Well, it wasn't particularly successful. A single factory was kind of commissioned on the Japanese island of Kyushu from the local ruler, but they were unable to obtain raw silk, which is what they were hoping to get from Japan, and then export it to China. And so after about 8 years of unsuccessful business, it was forced to close in 1623. But briefly, the British East India Company reached as far as Japan. I think the last thing that I wanted to mention and communicate is to clear up a misconception that I think some people might have, in that kind of this colonization of India and the East Indies was not or at least initially not, in my opinion, not particularly comparable to the colonization of the New World, particularly North America in the British context, in that the colonization of the New World was much more personally driven by individuals who were fleeing or migrating, rather than for reasons of economy and corporate trade, which drove this colonial thrust into the East Indies. And consequently, conflict, armed conflict that is, resulting in casualties and pitched battles and all that sort of thing, came a lot later in the history of the East India Company. We have to bear in mind that it didn't start as a company that had all of these rights and privileges. It was granted them after it had already been successful in the kind of traditional mercantile medium. It negotiated with local rulers to establish ports and fortresses and trading posts, protection on the coast of the bays. And only after it had been granted its own private army and that sort of thing did it inevitably perhaps begin its darker streaks, and perhaps therefore we could call that the moral of the story. To beware giving private corporations too much power, because they will use it to maximize profits at all costs. Would you agree with that conclusion?
I think that's reasonable, yeah. It's pretty incredible to imagine the necessity of a rebellion, like the Indian Rebellion of 1857, where people have to rise up against the rule of a corporation acting as a proxy for the British Crown. It's just amazing to think that the British monarchy had even privatized the running of a country.
Yeah. Do you see this being a risk in the future? Do you think this is a warning or a learnt lesson that won't be repeated?
Well, I think part of what allowed this to happen was the sort of the structure of Britain at the time and of other European powers at the time. I can't imagine something similar happening to anywhere near this extent. If we're to look on a smaller scale, certainly in my opinion, you can see examples of companies misusing their power. I mean, I think that's simply inevitable. If the purpose of a company is to generate profit, then the most successful companies are going to do that rather than focus on the moral success of the human race. So we've always got to pay attention to what matters are pressing and legislate accordingly. There are some benefits to having companies, I won't hesitate to say like the East India Company, but there are obviously some benefits to some level of free enterprise, but we just have to be very careful about what we allow free enterprise to do and how free they should be, because at the end of the day they should be existing to serve people in general, society as a whole, rather than actually what they obviously do exist to serve, which is the people that put money in. But that's more of a, when we start bringing it that close to the modern world, that's when it becomes more of a political take than a historical take.
Yeah, I agree. I think, and I would conclude by saying that I think the lesson I'm taking from this is that if everything starts to go to hell in a handbasket, it's much more likely that the tanks rolling onto my lawn won't be government tanks, but like Amazon Prime tanks or something. Fresh from the warehouse.
Yeah, yes, hopefully not Chinese tanks.
Well, hopefully not any tanks, really. No. Ideally.
I can't imagine Russia has any tanks left to send them across Europe, so I wouldn't be worried about that one. I'd be more worried about bombs. And frankly, I think that's just the state of the modern world. I think we're more likely to have power exercised through threat, in particular threat of annihilation, which, I mean, can you imagine what the world would have been like if the East India Company had access to nuclear weapons?
So maybe then... Well, maybe then we can say that regardless of what the most profitable product was, by far the most dangerous product of the East India Company was their saltpeter after all. And on that somber note, I think we've reached the end of our podcast.
Thank you for listening.